Hey everybody, this mess is a wiring harness that I just took off of one of those engines, and it was mostly attached to the engine. I picked up the engines at a wrecking yard and told them I wanted them as complete as possible. And so while they're not specializing in that kind of recovery, they did a pretty good job of not butchering the harness as it came off the engine, or I'm sorry, as the engine came out of the vehicles. This one came off of a 2005 Silverado with a 6-liter in it, and it's the same harness as an 04 or 03, really all the way to a 5-liter or 5.3 all the way up. Actually, I think even the 4.8 has the same harness. It's which would make sense. Anyway, so the reason I'm making this video is that if you are building an LQ4 or 9 or one of the 5.3s and you're going to use this harness, or you need to use this harness, you can certainly go out and buy Painless makes a pretty good setup, long leads on it, so you can make changes, and it's about $700, and there's nothing wrong with it other than you still have a fair amount of work to do. And when I did my first swap, I got a really clean harness and engine and decided, no drama, let's just make it work. I found a company in Indiana called GM Tuners that sold me a bench tune. I sent them the computer, and I told them what I was going to be building, and they set the computer up and took off all the security stuff from the computer, so that they could then reprogram it. And along with that came a pretty comprehensive set of instructions, not so much how to deal with the wires, but here's point A with this wire and where it goes. And it's real specific. It covers everything you need, and that gave me the confidence to tear into this and just approach it pin by pin out of the computer. There are a bunch of wires that are coming out of this harness that aren't needed anymore. Things like the gas tank purge valve, which is tied onto the intake manifold, things like oil level, and oddly enough, oil pressure also does not go through the PCM. Oil pressure is something that's communicated to the dash via a different control box. And so it's funny because the system may account for, hey, the pressure's too low, and it'll tell you, but it does not shut the computer off, or does not shut the car off or put it in limp mode, which I don't think. Anyway, so that's when you're doing your swap, you're going to need to source a separate sending unit and wiring to get oil pressure. But it does cover, the computer does want to know about coolant temp, although you won't be able to use that for a gauge. But the swap allows you to grab a tach, speedometer, things like that, for your swap. And again, you've got this giant harness. It's got a bunch of wires you don't need. If you're running a manual transmission, you can take out even more, because this is also handling the controller for the transmission, a 4L60, and that can be changed. You can have it retuned for a 4L80. Some came with that, and this one did not. This had a 4L60 in it, but I'm going to keep the wiring for that right now, and I might leave the harness in there and maybe run with a manual transmission, in which case there's some other things you have to do. But so I'm going to leave on this harness. I'm going to leave the wires in for the automatic transmission, even though I may not utilize them. The mess that it comes off of includes the fuse box, which is critical for you as far as figuring things out. You'll see there's a bundle of pink wires down there. Those are mostly power supplies for things. I think the only sensors that need voltage are the O2 sensors, and in that they're heated, and then the rest of the sensors are getting a signal and a return signal from the computer directly. The injectors certainly need electricity. The coil packs need electricity. What else? Drive-by-wire needs electricity, and that actually takes me to the other big deal. These years are drive-by-wire, which means that you want to source this box here off the firewall in the engine compartment, and you certainly want to get the pedal. You're going to probably do some changes to the pedal's geometry to get it to fit in your vehicle, unless you're doing a truck with a giant firewall, but I've had to do some alteration on that to make it fit in an A-body, which is on a video on Build Another 68 Chevelle that go into detail on that. But the drive-by-wire is slick. It keeps you from having to fight with mechanical stuff, and the throttle body on the intake talks to this thing and does a good job. So again, you can certainly source some stuff, but I like doing it myself. Certainly it takes some hours, but the hours involved, I think, are pretty rewarding. Also helps you understand what is going on with the engine. And it actually has helped me troubleshoot a little bit too when it behaves oddly. Certainly this thing will end up with an OBD2 port in it, which is what's needed to tune it, or have it dyno tuned, as well as for you to troubleshoot stuff. But frankly, I have not had problems with mine, other than I undersized a couple of fuses the first time I built the car, and I've had, there was one relay that gave out on me, and it was close to the 40 amp load and probably gave out with additional engine compartment heat. So I just split that situation up onto 2 relays, and everything was fine. So I'm encouraging people to try this stuff if you feel like it. It's a fun project. Yes, there are some plug and play options. The one thing I'll warn you about, though, is that with the drive-by-wire, there's a couple of weird things in that the computer needs there's a couple of wires it needs, and it's in the instructions, and it's pretty comprehensive. You can certainly find pinouts on the internet, probably for free, for various years and models, and you might even be able to get some instruction on how to deal with each individual wire coming out of the computer with this tune. But the weird things with drive-by-wire are that there's 2 wires. One of them needs to know when the brake light is touched, no big deal. The other one is a little counterintuitive, and what it needs is 12 volts all the time until you push the brake pedal, and then it needs to be an open circuit. And I believe what that's doing is just saying to the computer, hey, we're on the brakes, which means whatever's going on with the throttle needs to let up, so that you're not fighting it. I am certainly able to stand on the brakes and burn rubber, so it works. I'm assuming the computer knows what it's doing, but it does let me still do that. It doesn't keep me from being able to throttle with my foot on the brake. But that's a wiring thing that if you get that wrong, the drive-by-wire will go into an idle-only mode. Ask me how I know. And so you got to get that wiring correct. And for me, first time tackling this, I felt like, yeah, let's absolutely get some instructions figured out so that I'm not struggling, trying to learn things as I go. That way, I also had a way to ask specific questions when problems came up. So the first step is going to be kind of identifying everything as you're tearing the engine down. Certainly helps to mark things. What is not sitting here is the computer. The computer is off being worked on right now, or reprogrammed. Those are the 2 large terminals that go into the computer. That is the fuse box. This little mess over here are things that I'm literally going to just cut that off. Those are all things that went to the body, and none of that went to the engine. The engine harness is all here and on this side, but that wire handled the body, and I believed it handled things like ambient air temperature for the thermometer up on your mirror. It possibly handled airbags. Honestly, I have not ever bothered to trace it, but when you get a fuse box that has that on it, you cut it right off. You don't need it. I certainly will keep things for scrap distance of wire. I love reusing some of this wire if it's not too cooked. It's a really good gauge with really great shielding on it. So if I have to change lengths of other wire, I'd like to try to keep it the same wire or bigger, and solder all my connections and things like that. So that gets cut off, and the first thing I do is split the looms, spend a bunch of time getting the electrical tape off everything, and then really start some of these are a little crunchy, and you need to the wires inside, you need to split them open a little bit, not cut them or anything, but you just need to kind of break them open because they're stuck together with a lot of curves in them. And then you're going to start opening the back of those, which I'll have on a separate, or that'll be coming up in a little bit. But you start tracing each individual wire and matching it up with what you're given on what you have on your pinout sheet. I always check resistance to make sure that the wire has good continuity from the computer to whatever sensor it is, as well as look for breaks, look for areas of heat. This is my third harness that I've done soups and nuts, and one of them, I think my second one, had a loose part of the harness where it was not held where it was supposed to be, and it got a little bit cooked, and that caused me to do a lot of patching. And you're going to do that anyway, because where you end up putting your computer is probably different than what GM did. GM put it in the driver's side front engine compartment, kind of behind the radiator, or not behind, but in between the radiator and the wheel well, and just kind of had it hanging out in there in the compartment. The fuse box was up on that same fender edge, and then the wiring harness just went straight across the engine and went all over the intake and all the other side. So if you want to hide anything and really pretty it up, you're going to end up lengthening and shortening some of these wires, mostly lengthening, but again, it just depends on where the computer goes. So to wrap this section up, let's just do a quick rundown. Let's see, computer, fuse box, leaving all that attached so I can identify each wire, so I can say, okay, these are the ones from the coil, this is the coil pack, these are the ones from the injectors, these go there. That's going to be important, so when you're rewiring it into a fuse box, you know what's what and get the appropriate load. You cannot underestimate the value of a good ground, and the way GM does their grounds is they have a lot of ground wires in this. They bundle them together, and then there are probably 4 of that go. That one I believe is somewhere, oh yeah, that one's on the back of the engine block, and then there's a couple more that will appear as we untangle all this that also go to the engine block, and they may have been trimmed, but when you see the inside of the harness, you'll see there's these bundled black wires that have a sealed solder joint in them, and those will then go off on a pigtail to something like that. Let's see. Okay, this is a coil pack, and this would be on the right side of that driver's side, so that would be bank 1, 1357, and then it jumps over the intake. Let's see. This is a non-marked one. Oh, this went to the evaporator, or the fuel evap solenoid that sits on top of the intake, and that just vents fumes out of the gas tank. That is not something you need to run. Let's see what's back here. NOx sensor. There's a NOx sensor, set of NOx sensors that run under the intake, and that's a connection to them. And then on the other side, you've got bank 2, which is 2468. Those are injector connections, and they make a lot of sense front to back when you start to orient that, and it would be hard for you to screw that up, but as you're splitting the loom, it's good to keep them in the order that they're laid out, or you can mark them. This little stub is the crank position sensor, and it is a little bit of a pain on these years. It's tucked behind the starter motor, so servicing that sucks. With a header situation, you probably are pulling header. Well, you're definitely pulling header either way, even if you go with the stock one, and then the starter motor's got to get out of the way, and then you can get to it. So not a bad idea to put a brand new one in and really check thoroughly on that connection. It also, when you tuck it all back together, it's really nice to wrap a lot of heat shield on it. This was the starter trigger harness, and it got mangled coming out of the car, but that's an easy fix. And again, just protect it for heat because it's right next to the manifold on the passenger side. Let's see what else we got. We have that would be the cam position sensor, sits behind the intake. That is the oil pressure. Again, that's going to get deleted because we're going to use something else. I could leave the wires there and then just tap into them later. It's a 3 conductor, and you only need a 2 for most traditional, so I might do that. What is this puppy? Huh. I don't remember. Well, that's interesting. It's almost like the same connector there. Well, I'll figure that out. Again, with the pin out. Although that's got me stumped right now. What is that? Oh, that I know what that is. That's the map sensor on the back of the intake. Manifold absolute pressure, and so that's what the connection. I need to mark that. Then this is the drive-by-wire connector. It's 8 pins, and it goes onto the throttle body, and it's what activates the butterfly when you press on the pedal, as well as manages idle, I guess. What else we got? We've got a couple of mystery things here. They are not going to go anywhere. This over here is the MAF sensor, manifold, airflow, something like that. I'm blowing that one, but that, it goes up to the intake pipes. And then the long ones that are always fun to fight are the ones that go down to the O2 sensors. And in all these smog vehicles, you've got 4 O2 sensors. You've got 2, one on each side before the cat and one after the cat, and you can certainly run them that way. It's part of the questionnaire when you're sending your computer in to say, you know, hey, I want to run it just like it was. I opt to run it with just the forward ones, which just take care of the air-fuel ratio for running it smoothly. And there's a lot of wire to take out if you decide not to run the 2. And then the other big giant wire that comes down is the one that goes to the transmission and the transmission selector switch. It also has, you can see it there, that is the one that talks to the transmission. Those are different depending on whether you have all-wheel drive or two-wheel drive. I believe this came off an all-wheel drive because the bigger ones are generally tied also into the transfer case. And then that controller is, that connector is for the 4L60. And that also will fit on a 4L80, and it's very easy to repin it at the computer, so you can actually hook that up to either one, but you need to tell your tuner what transmission you're running. And then that connector is going off to the rear O2 sensor, and somewhere further upstream there's another one that handles the upstream one. So that's pretty much it, and next video will be showing this kind of torn open and getting into it. So this took about an hour to get this all cleared up. That's the loom that might be reusable for weird sizes. A lot of it got tossed. That was super oily. But there we go. So there's the connections. About 4 miles of tape taken off there. I hacked that other unusable, unneeded harness off there and unwrapped all this stuff. For visual, I kind of left it where on the right hand side you can see the 4 injector connections with the coil on the outside, and then on the left the other 4. So that's kind of the way it was laying in the engine compartment, and I haven't untangled all that yet, but to start pulling wires, but that's the idea. One of the things that was interesting was as I was going through the standalone harness that goes all the way down to the starter and the crank position sensor, I saw something kind of mangled, and this is exactly why you want to put eyeballs on all the wire. This wire is cut, sort of, but not all the way through. And I am when I throw the ohm meter on there, I'm sure it's going to show a connection, but it'll probably show a drop. But that would be a bad thing, because that wire, and there wasn't any visible damage other than some other connectors have been cut off for some reason before I got to it. So maybe that happened inadvertently. But that's a wire coming back from the crank position sensor, so that'd be a bad thing to not have that thing reading correctly. It's stuff like that why sometimes cars get given up on and just sent to the scrapyard. Be interesting to see if that thing is still connected enough to send a signal, but maybe it's intermittent. Anyway, obviously I'll repair it. I'm not going to be shortening all these wires yet because I don't really know with this setup where I'm going to put the computer. Haven't really decided that yet, and where everything's going to be. But I'll tell you, they're going to get lengthened and shortened. And I'll do that by soldering and using at least as heavy a gauge wire, if not heavier. And that will, for this stage, I'm just clearing out extra wires. And then that whole mess over there is transmission. There are two knock sensor connections on, I'm sorry, not knock sensor. There are two O2 sensor connections on there, and I'm assuming the physical further one is the second one, but I won't cut anything off until I'm into the computer pinout and looking at all those. And then on the other side, that coiled up bunch is the far one clearly, and then the closer one is further up the chain. But anyway, all right, I'll try to figure out a way to film opening up the boxes. Okay. I don't know if this is going to work, but these tabs on the end are, you got to kind of squeeze and pry at the same time with, you wish you had 6 more hands. They are on both ends, and then inside here there's a couple of clips that are just going to pop. And this gray thing, once this is off, it'll be very obvious what we're getting at. And I have tried different ways of getting this open, and usually we'll end up breaking one a little bit. These things are a little brittle, and this time I'm trying something a little different, which is working great so far. Oh, no, it snaps back in. Let's see if I can get a whole side out without breaking it. Oh, awesome. And that side came out, and I'm going to leave something in there so that it doesn't fall back in. No, I'm not. I'm going to hold it and go to the other side and do the same thing, upside down. Kind of grabbing that and prying against it. Not working. Let's try this side. There we go. That side, cooperate up and snap right back in. Small screwdriver. Again, slide that in there without touching any wires, or at least not prying on any wires. Again. Up and out. Okay, so I got both sides up and out, and then it's a matter of get under there. Something made a crunchy sound that didn't sound good. Okay. That wasn't as bad as it could have been. That one's not as brittle as I've seen. So there's a zip tie on there holding the wire up against that cover, which obviously can come off. And there we are. Okay. This is a typical, this is the back side of the pin connector for the, for where it plugs into the computer, and there's always going to be a little bit of moisture getting in there, and so what I do is just brush off this edge, because what I'm trying to get at are the 80 little numbers that are on there, and I don't know if you can see them. Let's try this. Drag that really close, but right along the bottom of each terminal there is a number, and for example, that is 1 through 20, 21 through 40, 41 through 60, and then 61 through 80. And all of those wires are on your pinout sheet, and they tell you right where they go, and they even tell you what color. If it is not on your pinout sheet, you can leave it alone, or snip it, or take the whole thing out. I tend to pull these wires out so that just, again, seems tidier just to take the whole pin out instead of snipping it back here, but you could certainly just snip it back here. I've seen guys do that before too. And then the trick is, on the other side, you've got these plastic cover, and on that, there's a little side that you give a little bit of a push to. You tip that out, and then you push the other side and tip that out. There we go. And that comes off. And those pins are what you're going for. This is a gasket that allegedly keeps it watertight when it's up against the computer, so take that out of your way. And as you can see, there's openings. I'll take the other side off too. And you can tell it's not fully loaded. I'm assuming they just designed this and for different models have different features and get loaded up with different things. And cooperating. Come on. Boom, there we go. Okay, so it's got a hole for, it's got spots for 80 pins, and that looks like that's about 2/3 to 3/4 filled. And I don't know, maybe between the two connectors, that connector and this connector, I think, I mean, I can count at some point, and I think that what's going to happen is about 15 are coming out or so. There's a couple of relocations that happen. The other module that we hacked off the fuse box, I believe, is what controlled the fans, and so we're adding or relocating a couple of dead wires, and there will be two outputs that will throw a low amperage positive signal to our relay system that will then kick on cooling fans. And your tuner can design that for 1 or 2 fans. It's really whatever you decide to do. If you're doing if you've got a truck that's got an enormous front and you can afford to have a gigantic radiator in there, a lot of guys will just go with one big fan. In the Chevelles that I've done, I've gone with 2 fans, just so that I had more fans on the radiator, but that's really up to what you're building or what you're trying to convert. So there we are. I will start moving stuff around and maybe show a picture of it later on, skinnied up. All right, thanks. So to wrap this up, this is the harness after it's been stripped of all the wires I don't plan on using. This one I left all the transmission wires into. The other harness that came off the other engine is going on to a project with a 6-speed, so I ripped all the transmission wires out of that project harness, and it's substantially smaller. Again, this is the same configuration you saw it in when it was loomed, and I'm keeping that there. I'm going to use one of these to test. I'm going to actually bench run both of these engines, and because of the way it's set up and dangling, everything's fine with this configuration, so I'm not going to tear this harness apart into the way it's going to be wired into the car yet. I'm just leaving it as is because frankly it was easier. So again, it's all stripped down. Got a bundle of wires there that are labeled with where the 12 volt needs to go, and the drive-by-wire module and pedal. You got your spark plugs, bank 1 down the right side, bank 2 down the left side, and this entire bundle over here is all the transmission wires. So when it's all said and done, again, this is all getting torn apart because I'm not going to have these wires sitting across the intake. That computer is going to go into the side of the cab of the car somewhere, keep it out of the weather, away from the heat. And then all of these wires are still going to need to go to all the sensors, but how they travel is really up to you. I'm going to show you how I did it on a 60. This was my first project, and I have played with it a little bit over the years, but for the most part, the wiring is dead on the same. I could lay that harness over everything that's here and plug it all in, and the computer would have to live up here. And there'd be a wiring harness kind of jumping from the firewall over. And what I opted to do was put it in the car in the glove box. And then because I was frankly nervous about troubleshooting, I left everything super easy to get to. This is the area that has the fuses, has the relays, and that big bundle coming out on the left is coming out from under the dash, and that's all the wiring, and then it goes behind the intake and then gets distributed. And as you can see, this is the left side of the engines coming up. The coil packs, the coil pack connector with the 4 injectors, and then a wire it keeps going and wraps around, and then that's the throttle body connection. On the driver's side, same thing. From behind the intake, it comes around, comes up over, drops off at the 4 injectors, coil pack, and then 3 additional things come up front. One is the MAF sensor, and the other is the alternator charge wire and the coolant temp for the computer. And along the back side, it drops back into the transmission, over the back of the transmission, along with the starter and crank's position sensor. I've got all of that powered by this mess here. That is a 70 amp fuse, marine breaker, actually not a fuse, a breaker, and that powers the engine stuff. And then I've got another large lead going all the way back to the trunk that handles the sound system as well as the fuel pump. I've got a sub panel in the trunk for that. And this is all covered with a cover. Normally I have it open just to show you. And after the first project, I was really expecting, if there's a troubleshooting problem, I just wanted everything handy. And what I have since learned is that actually this stuff just doesn't have troubleshooting problems if you get the wiring correct. You use the right gauge wires, use the right fuses, right breakers, the right relays. And so the second project I did, I put all that in the glove box using a very different box and fuse setup, which was coming over, which was this guy. And I already have gotten another one. I probably won't use those relays. Those are 40 amp relays. I have found 60 amp relays. So I'm going to use those just because they are give me a little bit more insurance with being able to load them up. And the additional heat from running them and inside the car maybe even can make them wear earlier. So I'm getting away from 40 amp except on really light duty stuff, but all the engine stuff I'm going to try to use the 60 amp relays for. And then obviously it's got tons of spots for fuses. So that whole box will handle everything on the engine management side. But again, if you've made it this far in the video, thanks for watching. I know there's a lot of stuff covered, but the idea and the point here is that if you want to save some money and you have time and not as much money and you want to learn all this stuff, it's actually pretty fun, and I'll tell you, it's extremely rewarding to know that you put every single wire in and ran it the way you wanted to run it and did all the connections and have it start up. It's just it's a blast, and so I highly recommend it. So if you have any questions, feel free to get into that. And the other channel, this video will be posted on Build Another Race Car, and there's also a Build Another 68 Chevelle, which has a lot more content on it from the last couple Chevelle projects that I've done. And thanks for watching.